The Market Music. Well, hello and welcome. Podcast from Stock. We're joined by David, chairman of First Time David has been podcast with us, and joining co-host is Pam Box. So it's great to have you. The first podcast that we're doing. David, welcome. How are you doing?
Thank you. We've been quite busy. Bolivian convocatory call for expressions of interest. Long and involved process involved. At least it's a very enthusiastic.
Pam, welcome as well. All things lithium and
Thanks for having me on, as you mentioned here at Stockbox. But
indeed. Let's get straight into a few things to cover. But first of all, lithium demand. A few lithium companies, and from what I can, lithium price is volatile. Some people say it's lump pipeline. It's a commodity that's trying to find its feet. But I mean, from your being the market at the moment, where's the growth going to come from? The Market Musings Podcast. Well, hello and welcome here to the Market Musings Podcast from Stockbox, where today we're joined by David Horgan, who is the chairman of Clontarf Energy. It's the first time David has been on the Market Musings podcast with us, and joining us as well as co-host is Pam, who interviewer for Stockbox. So it's great to have you both on. And Pam, actually, it's the first podcast that we're doing together. But first of all, David, welcome. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you. We've been quite busy on the Bolivian convocatoria, which is a formal call for expressions of interest. That's been a long and involved process involving many people, but at least it's a dynamic market, so we're all very enthusiastic.
Okay, excellent. And Pam, welcome as well. You're looking forward to talking about all things lithium, batteries, politics, and lithium brines.
I am indeed, Mark. Thanks so much for having me on. As you mentioned, It is my first podcast here at Stockbox, but what an interesting topic.
Indeed, yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, let's get straight into it. We've got a fair few things to cover, but first of all, perhaps looking at the lithium demand, David. We talk to quite a few lithium companies in the space, and from what I can understand, you know, there's the lithium price is quite sort of volatile. Some people say it's lumpy. It's a lumpy sort of pipeline. It's a commodity that's still sort of trying to find its feet, I think. But I mean, from your point of view, where are you seeing the sort of the lithium market at the moment? Where's the growth going to come? Where's the demand going to come from? And what's going to be what some of the driving factors do you think that are really going to be affecting the price of lithium and that supply chain?
Yeah, lithium, I think, is better thought of as a specialty chemical rather than a true commodity. Think of a commodity would be, say, Brent oil or WTI or iron ore or metallurgical coal. It is well understood. It's quoted on the London Exchange and elsewhere. People can buy and sell even on the spot market. Lithium's not like that. There's almost no purchases that we can see on the spot market, maybe 2%, something like that. So it really is a market where specific miners or processors sell to specific customers on long-term contracts on prices that are generally confidential. And those prices vary quite a bit. They vary by volume, which is normal enough, but also by purity, both the purity in terms of percentage lithium and also the impurities, because for some processes, certain impurities like calcium or manganese can be very problematical. But also, according to nation and growth rate and many other factors. So to us, it's actually quite reminiscent of markets like natural flake graphite that we used to be the premium supplier in for several years, where we could sell to Union Carbide to produce gaskets for nuclear submarines. How about I get into trouble mentioning these examples? For $2,000 a ton, we could sell to Höchst or SGL Technic for €2,000 a ton. But we could sell graphite that might not be very different to Phytre Radix refractories for maybe $450 a ton. So you could say, well, that makes no sense because it's all natural flake graphite. But even small purity differences, if you're making a gasket for a submarine, can be critical. And even if you don't think it's critical, the Defense Department thinks it's critical. So, and lithium is like that. It's a rapidly growing market. It's much bigger than most people think. If you go to a conference, even in Singapore 2 years ago or a few months ago in Argentina, you'll hear numbers like 400,000 tons thrown around. Our view, just counting it from the bottom up, is that it's at least 925,000 tons of lithium carbonate equivalent, and it's rapidly growing. It would appear to have grown by about 30% last year. Now, I know that sounds impossible, but if you add up what people are buying, and obviously there's some stocking and destocking effects, especially in China, you don't often see growth rates like that in any commodity market. And not only is the volume very dynamic, but the type of product that people are buying and looking to buy is quite dynamic. Like when we first looked at lithium, this would be in the 90s, the standard product was about 90% purity. It was, mined as a co-product really from other metals in Southern Africa, mainly a bit in Australia. That's all transformed now. I mean, people don't really want less than 98, 99% pure. And there are people who buy lower grade. It's called technical grade, but they're upgraders. So they would be typically Chinese buyers that take the product and they upgrade it through various processes, sometimes quite dirty processes, to a high purity product. So you're looking at a very dynamic world, long-term contracts, but you don't often see growth rates like that. And you asked where does the product go? Well, what lithium does, it does many things. It's everyone knows that you give it to prisoners, to make them less amorous in jail. So it has some tiny medical applications, but historically it's been used basically in glass and ceramics and industrial applications like that, with a few niche applications like nuclear weapons and so on. But that's not what's driving the growth. The growth has been driven mainly by lithium-ion batteries. Why lithium-ion batteries? Well, the conventional battery is a lead-acid battery. It's been around for 170 years. It's a very good battery, but it has certain problems we all know about. You don't disconnect your battery, you go skiing for 2 weeks and the car doesn't start. And while it can turn off the engine a couple of times, it doesn't really have the long life and power you need for an iPhone or a computer used on a flight. And a whole host of new applications, high tech, defense, et cetera, et cetera. So what's driving the demand in recent years has actually been lithium-ion batteries for EVs. Last year, they were 80% of demand. This year, probably about 75%. And then you've got about 8 to 10%, which is things like your smartphone and your computer, and many of the devices you may have around the house, like power tools or whatever. And then the balance is new emerging applications. And they're a very broad spectrum. And many companies in Japan and Germany and the United States particularly are innovating in that area. Sometimes quite secretively, and that's a very dynamic market, and that's where they're looking for super high purity. Why super high purity? Because one of the problems with lithium is that it's a very volatile metal. It's the lightest metal. It's right there after hydrogen and helium. You think back to your periodic table, which is why it can't be substituted, because since Medvedev, no one is inventing any new elements, right? Medvedev gave us the grid, and all we've been doing for a century and a bit is plugging into the gaps in the periodic table. So while there are many different battery technologies and will continue to be, nothing quite matches the power content and the economic feasibility. Yes, if you want to spend millions of dollars per unit in the space station, there are other solutions. But for your EV or your computer or your smartphone, for the next 10 years, you're going to be stuck with lithium ion. However, one of the problems with charging and discharging is that in nature, nothing ever works 100% efficiently. And when you recharge, what you find is that if there's any impurities in the electrolyte, which is like a chemical through which the ions flow, if there's any impurities, they will tend to build up on the electrical anode, and gradually you might find a crystal forming, and eventually that crystal can actually puncture the membrane, separating the positive from the negatively charged parts of the electrolyte, and that can cause a short circuit and a fire. And the fires are hot, like you can get a 1500 degree Celsius fire, which is pretty hot. And if that happens on, say, the car container in the middle of the Pacific, that fire will burn out of control because the vehicle will be in the middle of the hold, and the current navigation, fire suppression techniques are not designed. Maybe military ones are, but not civilian ones are not designed to put out a fire of that intensity. So you have to wait for that fire to burn out. So the only real solution to avoid fires, and people obviously don't like fires in their car, is to avoid fires by not having short circuits, and that means higher purity. And obviously design and looking at solid rather than liquid and things like that. That's what's driving the push for higher purity. The other thing that has changed a lot is, you mentioned geopolitics. It is truly amazing how the world has changed in the last 5 years or so. Like, I can remember trying to interest people in the 90s in evaporite products like lithium, and there was zero interest. And you would talk about, this new camcorder I bought in Heathrow Airport, and it's really cool. And people would say, well, in 10 years' time, maybe it'll be a market. So no one would invest in it when we first looked at it in the 90s. And they were 100% correct, because it has taken 20 years to really take off. And it's only really taken off in the last 10 years or so. But what has changed in terms of geopolitics is not all countries have taken this discounted cash flow approach to developing new resources. And the one country that took a long-term view is the Chinese. And as I understand it, just talking to people for over the last, I first went to China in 87, then in the 90s. And while they're very entrepreneurial people, they like money as much as you or I, they do have a longer term perspective. And they took the view, like the Japanese had, that automotive is a big sector. However, when they were looking at breaking into automotive, the cars were pretty crap. Like, let's be honest, you got into a taxi in Beijing, it wasn't the best experience. Whereas the Japanese got in early enough in the early 70s to be able to use their greater efficiency to dominate smaller engine and efficient engines in cars. The Chinese were too late to duplicate what the Koreans and Japanese had done. And you look at, say, diesel engines, they couldn't compete with Volkswagen diesel design. It was very hard to compete with state-of-the-art petrol driven. So they made a decision to leapfrog, go for the new technology, which at the time looked a bit mad. If you think back to the early noughties, not many people would have agreed with state policy, but they set out ruthlessly to tie up critical resource minerals, what we now call them, everything from cobalt in DRC to nickel in Indonesia to copper in different parts of the world. And from about the year 2000, you couldn't go through Africa, even posh hotels, without seeing multiple Chinese people speaking Mandarin, even in the middle of the pandemic. And they painstakingly for 25 years have focused on that. And I can remember having conversations with Volkswagen and American companies, and they sort of waved, oh, don't be ridiculous. The army has these stockpiles of everything out in the Nevada desert. The free market will always work. Don't worry about the Chinese. Anyway, they're becoming capitalists. That changed in 2010. If you remember, there was a clash between Japan and China over a few islands, which had no real significance apart from fishing rights in the Western Pacific. And the Chinese, if you recall, they cut off rare earths. Now, rare earths doesn't include lithium or cobalt, but they cut off rare earths. Now, until that point, we used to sell natural flake graphite to high-quality battery manufacturers, of which about 85-90% were in Japan when we were doing this in the 90s. Almost overnight, Japan lost that 90% dominance. They're still there, like Panasonic and so on, but they're now about 10%. And China took that market. So that sent a shockwave, 2010, 2011. Suddenly, we realized that the market is not free. And we've been forced reluctantly back into like 18th century mercantilism, what built up British Empire and the Dutch Empire and all the rest of it. The idea that you have to seize the sources of key raw materials as well as markets, which runs against the grain. Like, we're all free marketeers, but that's the reality. And, the first person to see it in many ways outside of China and Japan, obviously the Japanese quickly sought alternative sources, not successfully for the most part. It was actually Trump. Trump saw the Chinese were gaming the system in a whole series of ways. Stealing industrial property, selective tariffs, you name it. Trump, in his inimitable way, targeted some of the main offenders, and the Chinese very skillfully retaliated by targeting the soya farmers, who are mainly red state, constituencies in Florida, which is orange juice, and quite successfully influenced some of those key constituencies. But once Trump had identified the problem and acted on it, maybe inelegantly, it's interesting that Biden continued with the Trump policy and even passed this hilariously misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, which has nothing to do with inflation, much less reducing inflation, but is to do with targeting the Chinese threat. And that was another shock to people like the Europeans, because it didn't just target the Chinese, it targeted everyone who's not in NAFTA. So if you're a Chinese manufacturer in Mexico, you can flip onto the system, or a Canadian company. But the Europeans, despite heavy lobbying by people like Emmanuel Macron, have been, as far as I could see, completely unsuccessful in getting themselves into the Inflation Reduction Act. And the net result is that the Europeans are now prejudiced not just by the Chinese, but also by the Americans. And they belatedly woke up to this. I told you that, Volkswagen laughed at us about 8 years ago. They have now turned around, and the European Commission has been driving this new initiative called the Critical Resource Mineral Initiative, and driving, I have to say, very energetically. Britain also has its policy, and we've stayed in contact, of course, with the British Embassy in Bolivia over this. And they have identified about 35 key critical resources and about 17 that are critically strategic. And they have really got involved in trying to promote not just the mining to a minimum 10% within the EU or in countries very close to the EU, like, say, Switzerland or Norway, but a higher percentage of processing, about 40% of processing, and 60 to 70% of final product manufacture, without really understanding the intricacies of the market. Like a lot of people you speak to in Washington or Brussels or London, indeed, they think that if you have access to a long-term contract, say in Argentina, Bolivia, that solves your problem. But of course, there's a long value chain. The mining of hard rock in Australia, I mean, Australia is a great country and it's a safe country and we love the Aussies, but the Aussies don't have any significant processing or upgrading capacity. They're trying to build a couple of projects. They haven't really worked so far. What the Aussies do very sensibly, they make as much money as they can from mining, which they do, and they ship off the hard rock to China, and the Chinese burn it for 2 days at 800 degrees Celsius in a big furnace powered by coal. So the idea that Tesla can advertise its clean car, which is a bit comical, because of course it uses many more raw materials per unit than conventional cars, and often produced by very dirty processes. So the EU has been driving not just the idea to get hold of the critical raw material, but also to control the processing, and if possible to make it green. And which really narrows your options. So,
David, let me just jump in there. It's fascinating, some of the points that you've covered. So what you're saying is the way that, Australia could be selling this to the Chinese and then they're burning it at 800 degrees Celsius. It's not very clean energy. So the EU is involved there. So say, for example, using that analogy with your lithium, how would that then ensure that it's clean energy?
Yeah. Now, we've been interested for a long time in hard rock as well, because there's lots of sources in Southern Africa and West Africa and elsewhere. But what the EU wants, and what we believe will eventually have a price premium, maybe we'll be wrong, but that's our belief, is for clean and green lithium, which can only really be produced out of brines, which is like a very salty liquid. Now, the sea is also briny, but much lower grade. And but there are certain geologies in the world where you've got these salt lakes. I don't know if you've seen photographs, but you can actually land a plane on them. Like they're perfectly flat. In fact, if you drive across a salt lake, like in Bolivia or Argentina or Chile, you can actually see the curvature of the earth. It's so flat. It's
incredible.
And very beautiful. But what's happened geologically is that originally the mountains had lots of hard rock. And Mother Nature, when the Andes were created, Mother Nature grinds them down and the lithium gets leached into rainfall and rivers. But if the river can't get out to the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean, it gets trapped in valleys and eventually it evaporates. So what became maybe a few parts per million may become 500 parts per million lithium. And it has sodium and boron and other salts as well. And what's happening is that you still have the concentration technique that humans perform in industrial plants, except that Mother Nature has done it over 100,000 years, and she's done it with her own use of energy just from rainfall and earthquakes and all the rest of it. So what we're doing is we're effectively drilling through the first few meters of hard rock, because salt is quite hard. People think it's soft. It's actually, you can drive across it. It's quite hard. And you go into a matrix, which is like a mixture of, salt crystals and clays and pebbles and things like that. And we extract the brine and we process it in what's called a direct lithium extraction plant. And in our case, we use ionic separation to take the valuable metals out of the brine. And not everyone uses the same technology. There are people that use reagents, solvents, absorbent techniques. There's many different technologies, about 43 companies working on different technologies, but ours duplicates what happens in your kidney. So if you think, like, you go out on a Friday night, you're drinking lots of wine, you're having a nice meal, all that's in your alimentary canal. So it's a miracle your body is able to take the useful elements out of that meal and separate the less useful elements. And if you think the temperature of your body about 37 degrees, it doesn't need a lot of heat, doesn't need a lot of pressure, and yet it's quite an efficient way of processing, and it does that by ionic separation. So what we've sought to do is to duplicate that technology, and in that we're actually building on innovations that were brought about by the Soviets. Like, the Soviets had a problem with their nuclear safety, and they had lots of accidents, as you know, and they had a problem with radioactive groundwater, and they developed ionic separation for strontium, which was actually very efficient. And basically, we've continued to develop that technology with our technology partner, and we've got it working well in lab scale and pilot plant. And as a result, we're now building a pilot plant with their Indian technical partner in northern India. And what we're doing is we're running initial sample volumes, and all going well with this convocatoria process, we'll be sending larger volumes of brine to run through that plant. And all going well with the commercial negotiations, we will deploy one or more pilot plants to the salares, or the salt pans in South America, and start producing.
Okay. Amazing. That sounds really, really interesting. So as you mentioned, you're getting the clean energy, you're getting the clean lithium from Bolivia, from the salt lakes, where Mother Nature's already done the work. You mentioned then that it's been sent to northern India, and are you extracting any lithium from there as well, or is that just where it's being processed?
Yeah, we've been extracting lithium in lab scale at the laboratory complex in Texas, but there's a number of reasons why we go to India. I mean, India is much more competitive in terms of these chemical processing plants. Very good engineering skills, especially some of the top Indian companies, and they're very interested in South America for the same reasons as anybody else. But they don't have a lot of historic links with South America. I mean, there are some in Venezuela and Curacao, but and the reason, usually there's a simple reason why links haven't developed historically, and the reason is that the only way for an Indian technician to get to South America is to fly to London to overnight, and then fly to Bolivia or Peru, which takes 40 hours. Yeah. Now, it's still a long way for us to go, but we don't have to fly to London first. If there were direct flights, you'd find more Indian companies in South America. So it's just interesting how these things evolve. It all comes down to personal comfort in the end. But anyway, the Indians are very competitive. And also, there's much more regard for confidentiality in India than there is in China. Like, long experience has told us and our partners that if you build a plant in China, you're legally obliged to share the technology, which is why people like Mercedes don't use their very best technology. But even if you don't share the technology, as some companies try not to, they will extract the technology from the plant by various means. And the net result is that they will, within 2 or 3 years, be duplicating whatever you're doing, whether inside the patent or not. and therefore you can't build your plant in China, which would probably be the best place to build it in. And the second best is India.
Okay. And I mean, Bolivia is, what's that like as a jurisdiction to do business in? Are there things you've got to concern about? Are there sort of legal constraints perhaps, or constitutional constraints that might be facing early stage projects such as yourselves?
Bolivia is not for beginners. I've been going there since 1986, and it's a fascinating country. Culturally very interesting, tremendously mineralized in that a lot of European inflation in the 16th, 17th century was caused by one mountain, Cerro Rico in Potosí, a silver mountain, and so Bolivia's enriched a lot of people in the Spanish Empire. Also in the 20s and 30s, you've heard of Patiño, one of the world's richest men, the tin billionaire. And but Bolivia has not been very good historically in capturing that value for its people for various reasons. Like, for example, in World War II, they were pressured into joining the Allied war effort, which was maybe a noble endeavor, except that they had to sell the zinc and the tin, etc., to the American military at pre-war prices. Whereas the Argentines, who are much more cynical and pragmatic and maybe more sympathetic to the fascist side, they continued to sell to both sides as long as they could, but they sold at market prices during World War II. So the Argentines profited enormously and the Bolivians didn't. And this historical experience has made them a bit cynical about free market capitalism. So they, when we were first dealing in Bolivia, which in a serious way was from 2008, the only way to deal effectively was in joint venture with the state. So we actually had a negotiation with the military pension fund, believe it or not, and that worked really well, except that the new left-wing government didn't ratify our contract. So while we were working really well with the military pension fund, I love them as a partner, and I think they were very happy. The state itself, the left-leaning state government, thought that they could control the whole lithium value chain. But of course, that's totally impractical, because the only countries that have the entire lithium value chain today is probably China, realistically. Nobody else has all the elements of the chain. And only a handful of countries are making EVs in industrial scale. So the idea that you would go at, I'm talking about 4,000 meters of altitude, you would go from mining in a country that has never exported significant quantities of lithium to building EVs. It was never very practical. And we explained this to our friends, and you could always get it across to the technicians or the functionaries, but you could never get it across the politicians. Now, and the politicians at the time, they would have been the equivalent of maybe Jeremy Corbyn, well-meaning, but not very practical, arguably, or maybe Liz Truss. I don't want to be biased. But what's changed in the last few years is that they did pass a lithium law, and they did hire technicians. And by 2017, when they passed the law, they'd had the first generation of indigenous people who had been trained in world's top universities. So the current president did a PhD in Warwick, for example. You had people trained in Barcelona and in Berlin and so on. And so you were able to talk to the first generation of people that were trusted by the government, that were indigenous people or mixed race or whatever. So you didn't have the hang-ups about turning up and telling locals what to do. And they understood the issues. And straight away, we hit it off with them. They invited us back 2018, and we started developing a joint venture. We did a lot of exploration. They gave us samples, so they were very good. But what the politicians wanted was us to have to enter a bid round where we would commit ourselves to industrializing and commercializing the product. Now, remember, at this stage, we didn't even have a resource estimate, and we hadn't got a pilot plant, and we couldn't commit. As a London stock market company, you can't commit to building plants and industrializing product until the feasibility study is done. So we painstakingly explained it to them, and they said, well, the Chinese national companies are happy to do that, but of course they do that everywhere. They always commit, they have the state behind them, and of course they still haven't industrialized, and they still haven't exported material quantities of lithium. Also, the Russians, who are technically very strong, also entered the call to convocatoria or bid round process. But not having delivered in recent years, the Bolivians are not stupid. They realize that Argentina's surging ahead, Chile is surging ahead, the Aussies are mining hard rock, even South Africa getting into the game. And they don't want to be left with a stranded resource in 20 years' time when the world moves on to some new technology. So they looked at it more pragmatically, and they had this second bid round. Now, it's not 100% pragmatic yet, and sometimes they can be a bit naive about how business and markets work, but they launched this bid process and started off with about 48 companies, and we're now down to 21. They're mainly Chinese, a few Russian. There are 6 EU, 1 British, one Swiss. And we're in the middle of this process. So just last week, we passed the technical side of it. They were content with our explanation of the technology and the due diligence of the technology. Mm-hmm. And now we've got to go through a bit bureaucratic financial clearances, which is basically 5 years of audited balance sheets and a risk rating. And nobody's quite sure what that means. It might be nothing at all. It might be a big deal. The problem dealing with governments everywhere in the world is that no politician or functionary really understands finance. Now, finance is simple to all your listeners. Investors like return and prefer more to less. They dislike risk and prefer less to more. So you can have whatever constraints you want as long as the investor sees an adequate rate of return for their investment. And a lot of what we've been involved in, is almost as an intermediary, trying to explain to the financial markets the concerns that they have in a part of the world that is volatile, where you don't have an independent court system, where you do have a left-leaning government. But really the answer is a bit like we persuaded the car makers in Germany and the EU. If you need a critical resource mineral, you go where it is. If you need a clean resource, you go where the clean resource is. Like, you cannot avoid going to DRC for cobalt, because that's where 2/3 of the world's cobalt is. You can't avoid going places like Indonesia for nickel, or Chile for copper, and so on. You have to go where the mineral is. And our job is to almost translate between these two worlds, give the Bolivians what they want in terms of influence or control over the value chain and value added for their economy, and give the European automotive companies what they want in terms of offtake.
Okay. And if we can talk a little bit about, you mentioned it before about the EU and governments around the world doing things to lock up their supply chains. We've talked about the Chinese cornering the market there, and probably going to be a very dominant player in this space, in this green economy, this green shift, electric vehicle space. But certainly the Americans are not going to want that, and they're not going to go down without a fight. And we see the Americans are definitely buying up, or actually investing directly in projects around the world, not for the return, but also for really just to secure those supply chains in country. Now, I know you do a lot with the European Union, don't you? You're part of I don't know what the word is, a committee or a group, that consults with the Union. Is that right? I wonder if you can perhaps explain what you do with the European Union in Brussels, and what the European Union's attitude is to securing Europe's supply of these metals, and what incentives, what programs they might have going on to either release funding for certain projects, or to help with negotiation or trade, diplomatic links, that kind of thing. I think that'd be really interesting to talk about, particularly with your insider knowledge on what might be going on in Brussels.
Yep. Well, just as the Japanese responded with alacrity in 2011, and the British government has also had trade visits to Latin America, the Europeans have really embraced this theme with enthusiasm. And the engine is the European Commission, which is like a proto-government. And, they do have a lot of skills. I mean, they don't have a lot of maybe business experience, but they have a lot of skills, technical language, and so on. And what they've done is they've launched an initiative and formed action groups. And they actually organized site visits and high-level negotiations in November, December in Bolivia and Argentina. And they concluded strategic agreements with Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and negotiating one now with Bolivia. With a lot of follow-up in Brussels. They had the senior ministers from the Bolivian government in Brussels in February. I was asked to open up that debate, and in a way, we performed this translation function. The Europeans want offtake and have money, and the Bolivians want the money, obviously, because they have very few hard currency access at the moment. But they're suspicious of international capitalists, and they want, not unreasonable, but they want over a reasonable period, they want value added in their economy. So we found that, generally speaking, the markets don't really understand where the locals are coming from, because they've no experience. They haven't lived there. They don't speak the language. They don't know about the indigenous cultures. And equally, I think the Bolivians have limited experience of the outside world. The older regimes, before the indigenous government got elected, they had their bank accounts in Miami and would go shopping in New York. So in a way, they had a better understanding of how the gringos think. But one of the problems with democracy is that the new government doesn't have that understanding. So there's an element of getting comfortable with each other. And as a result of that, we first met the Bolivians in these high-level negotiations. And luckily enough, I was actually asked to summarize it, to my surprise. So sometimes when you summarize what you think should have been agreed rather than what was actually agreed. So I said, well, look, in principle, the Europeans have agreed to fund infrastructure related to the lithium development. Now, that's critically important because, as many of your punters will know, you go into a new part of the world, whether it's the Himalaya or Africa, whatever, typically 2/3 of your capital cost is infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Roads, electricity, water, you name it. And only 1/3 is the plant. People always assume it's the plant. No, it's mostly the infrastructure. And it's hard for the EU or the British government or the Americans to give money for your plant, because how do they assess risk? It's not their business. It's relatively easy for them to fund qualifying infrastructure because infrastructure boosts economic growth. Think clean water rather than polluted water, mains electricity from a hydro or geothermal plant rather than burning fuel that you've cut down in an endangered forest. So they've agreed to fund, and they've got $4 billion, available for this category of investment. So it's quite a bit of cash, and that was agreed in principle. Or at least I declare that was agreed in principle, and in return, I understood, talking to the Bolivians, that they had informally offered the Russian contractor a percentage offtake. So I simply said that the Bolivians, in principle, are prepared to commit to offtake to European automotive and other companies, and nobody objected. So that became the record. So those were two critical measures, because once you've agreed to provide the money in return for offtake, in a way, the rest is relatively straightforward, because all the problems with legal title and lack of an independent core system and all the rest of it sort of fall away if you have rights over the offtake. Because let's say it goes to Mercedes, you would have first call after whatever percentage goes in royalty. You would have first call for the capital cost and the operating cost to be recovered. So that's an elegant solution to all problems. However, there's always other issues as well. And one of the issues, because of the history of Bolivia, is that the local community are naturally concerned that they will profit, that all the profits don't get taken by politicians in the faraway capital. This is a problem in Africa as well, and probably everywhere in the world. And the answer is to give a royalty to be spent in the local community. Bolivia is a mining country. Traditionally, it's charged 3% royalties, of which typically about 1% might have been deployed in the local department. So the obvious solution would be that you would increase the royalty to be allocated to the local community. So maybe they might get as much as 5 or 8% for their local province. It would be like if there was a mine in Scotland, the Scottish government would have a chunk of money before it goes to Westminster. And most problems get solved with money, right? So now the disadvantage of that sort of solution is that it builds more inflexibility into the fiscal terms. Because if you're paying a royalty, you pay that royalty if prices are low or high. And in many commodities, that would be an issue. because, there is a commodity cycle. Sometimes prices are too high, sometimes they're too low, depending on capacity additions and surges in growth, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's less of a problem in lithium just because of the growth rates that we've described and the fact that even though there's lots of new projects in Australia and so on, there's so many delays and barriers, from eco protesters and all the rest of it, that it's very hard to see, double figure growth rates being supplied from the existing projects. They'd be doing very well, even to produce 10% growth in supply, never mind last year's 30%. So I don't really see price as a problem for the next 10 years. Who knows what happens after 10 years? And the reason is that the product definition itself is changing, and it's getting increasingly difficult to specify. And that means that fewer and fewer hard rock projects in the world will qualify. Like, even if you look at Australia, the Aussies don't mine all their deposits. They only mine the highest grade, like 4.2% grade, and they only mine the ones with the best mineralogy. So if you've got any sort of refractory ore or problems, they just don't bother with that. The Aussies are interested in making money immediately, and it's been a successful strategy for them.
So
sounds like.
I'll just finish off. On what the EU are doing. So you're effectively saying that they will look to perhaps fund infrastructure in country, because that's a big cost, and the return would be a percentage of the product that is produced. So that would then go to a consumer of that product, i.e. a car manufacturer, and it locks up the supply chain. Is that kind of the thinking in the European Union?
That's the basic thinking. Now, the detail will be more complicated, because if you've no battery manufacturer in Europe, and there's very few of them, you'll be making the battery probably in China. But we can do we can do offsetting contracts. We do this in oil. Like, if you produce oil for a country, let's say a country like Ireland, you don't have an adequate refiner, but you get it refined in Scotland or in Rotterdam in return for so many percentage of products. So all these problems can be solved. Now, it may not solve the geopolitical problem. Let's say, God forbid, there's a war, but ultimately, it's a question of minimizing the dependency rather than eliminating it altogether.
And how far along are you at the moment in Bolivia with the infrastructure?
Well, we're in the middle of this bid round process, our convocatorio, and we've passed the initial and the technical phases. We're now in the financial assessment. If we get through that, then we pass to the detailed analysis and assessment of all the bids that they've received. And that would lead then to negotiation and the signing of a convenio or contract, after which we will complete the pilot plant process and deploy production plants to site.
Okay. And the pilot plant, would you have an idea of when you would like to see that constructed?
Well, we're constructing it now. There are some delays on long lead items, because for this ionic separation, you need very high performance sensors, because you need to constantly monitor the pH and other elements, and also very high purity elements, which requires very high performance. At the moment, the only manufacturers of these very high performance sensors and membranes are in Germany, and there have been long lead issues just because the way the world's supply chains have got screwed up by COVID and the rapid growth of this market. But basically, we aim to be in production of the pilot plant in June. We'll organize then visits with the Bolivian authorities to India, and all going well in the negotiation, we would hope to deploy a plant early in 2025 to one of the salt lakes in South America.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so a pilot plant, that's quite soon, June, and get those inspections done, and then deploy a working plant and effectively be in production in 2025. You don't need to do any further studies, any further drilling, any further proving up of the resource?
Well, the resource is actually very large compared. Like, Bolivia has at least 23 million tons recoverable, so it's over 20% of the world's resource. And it's funny, when you talk to geologists, they always want to do a lot of drilling and resource estimates, but it's a bit like going into Saudi Arabia and saying, well, how do I know, if it's 100 years reserves or 300 years reserves? And the answer it doesn't matter, because you'll have your cost recovery within a few years, and maybe in 20 years' time there'll be a different technology. So as long as you're confident that there's resource for decades, it's not a critical issue.
And do you have the figures at the minute? Do you have the sort of the idea of capex and expected revenue margins, that kind of thing?
Yes, I mean we're budgeting for the initial operation. We're budgeting about 200 million euro, and that would exclude infrastructure. So it would be obviously much more expensive, but we had to fund the infrastructure. And that's why we're spending so much time talking to the funding agencies in Brussels, which includes the state, the member state owned, the German, the Dutch, and others, as well as the European Investment Bank. In the past, we've also dealt with CDC in Britain, the Commonwealth Development Corporation, who helped us going into Mozambique, and they were fantastic because they weren't just a state body. Margaret Thatcher had made them more responsive to free market ideas. And that meant that they didn't just give soft loans, they also took an equity stake. And the great thing about a state body, whether it's Britain or anywhere else taking an equity stake, is that it makes a future government much more reluctant to try and expropriate you or squeeze you on, say, tax terms, because you're not squeezing a junior company, you're squeezing a state. And that's why we've been talking to some of the member states about taking a small minority stake in the group. We wouldn't want them to be more than maybe 10%. And they do it. I mean, the French, for example, have taken a 30% stake in a French company, Eramet, so that they do it. And apart from the capital, which tends to be sticky and long-term, it gives you a lot of protection. It gives you what the Russians call krisha, a air cover.
So the product you will be sort of selling in the end, what would that be? Is it lithium hydroxide?
Well, the European off-takers are moving towards lithium hydroxide, but the market's currently dominated by lithium carbonate.
Right. Okay.
And but you can tweak the chemistry to get whatever product you want. I mean, the more critical issue is actually purity. And so our view is that the customer is always right.
Of course.
No doubt this will go. The technology is rapidly evolving in many of these applications. And you talk to an off-taker, and they'll tell you one thing today, another thing in a month's time. So we need a flexible system that gives the market what it wants.
Okay. And both of those.
Go on, Pam.
Let me just jump in there. Are both of those lithium sources used in batteries?
Yeah, they're both feedstock to ultra pure lithium output, which is deployed mainly in lithium-ion batteries.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And as you mentioned, it's a growing industry, not just based on the car batteries. Can you just recap for the listeners right now?
It's a very dynamic market. Like when we first looked at it, there were no lithium-ion batteries, right? Shows how old I am. And then this explosion in performance happened in the early 90s with the camcorder, and all consumer electronics. You go through things in your house, you'll find lots of things with lithium-ion batteries in it.
Mobile phones, laptops, all of that. These are still growing industries.
Rapidly growing, and new applications that are only now being developed. EVs have sort of caught the imagination because there were a lot of very optimistic projections for electric vehicle penetration of the market, and they have grown rapidly, based on strong support in North America and Western Europe. The problem has been that they're quite expensive to build, and as we've seen, they use a lot of raw materials. And the people that make them most efficiently are the Chinese, which of course runs against the American plan under the Inflation Reduction Act, and also the Europeans. I mean, the European Commission chief Ursula von der Leyen has been talking about the Chinese building overcapacity, which, as anyone in a free market knows, it's a contradiction in terms. Now, you add capacity for the profit motive, and if you can make money, if you can cover your cash costs, you take share, and if you're losing cash, you exit the market. So it should be the market that decides who builds your EV. And part of the reason why the Chinese have been successful is that if you ever look inside an EV, it's a very simple machine. Like an electric motor is just copper wiring and magnets. It's much simpler than
it's much simpler than in combustion. Yeah, definitely.
And so it's an ideal product for a very efficient, low-cost producer like Chinese to build. And it's very hard to imagine high-cost Chryslers or Japanese or European cars competing with that. So Europe has a choice and America has a choice. Do you want a green transition, in which case you need Chinese vehicles, or do you want to protect your automotive industry?
Yeah.
Now, what will happen, it's probably like the 80s, is that the Chinese will build plants in Sunderland and Wolfsburg and all the rest of it, which is like a messy compromise. But these are the policy decisions that they must grapple with. But whether it's in China or in Japan or Britain or wherever, they're going to need the raw materials, and one of the key ones is lithium.
Yeah, indeed. And just to finish on the point of the project and its economic viability, are you when you get the pilot plant going? Of course, the idea is to demonstrate to the local stakeholders. But will that also feed into? Do you have pre-feasibility, definitive feasibility when you can really get an idea of the economics of this project? I mean, you said sort of 200 million estimated capex, excluding infrastructure. But in terms of the sort of the product you will sell and the cost it will actually take to get to that, do you have an idea of that yet, or does that still to be?
Yes, I mean, all the initial numbers done based on the pilot plant work shows very good margins. But in a way, it's a bit like a oil contract or a diamond mine. There's very high rates of return, but it's not a certainty that the London investor or the individual company gets a high percentage of the economic rents or rate of return. That is a matter to be negotiated with the state, because if you look at the oil market, for example, Nigeria, 80% goes to the state. Venezuela, Iraq, Iran, like 97, 98% goes to the state. So there's a negotiation yet to be had with the authorities, and we haven't touched on fiscal terms yet. And they themselves are reviewing it. And in fact, one of the things that I've had to do in recent months is talking to high-level policy decision makers about what policy should they have, because they do have experience in this. They are a mining country, so they know that there are cycles, and they were very successful in gas particularly and condensate in the 90s, adding a lot of reserves in just 5 years, 95 to 2000. Then when the left-wing government came in and changed the contracts from production sharing to service contracts, there was a collapse in exploration. Now, that didn't matter for 10 or 15 years because they had lots of reserves that we discovered in the 90s. Now it matters. Now they're having to import Argentine gas to re-export to Brazil. And the reason is that investors haven't been exploring, and investors haven't been exploring because the rate of return was inadequate, given all the risks. So they do have experience of what happens if you don't share value with the various stakeholders. And the moral of the story for all of us is that for something to work, it has to work for everyone. It's got to work for the state. It's got to work for the investor, for the operators, and for the local community. You might get away for a year or two with screwing one or more of the stakeholders, but it won't be enduring. It has to work for everyone.
Okay, so that's still to be determined depending on the Bolivian state and their policies. But that will be worked through presumably as you go down the pilot plant and do the various testing, and you can communicate that the potential routes to market and cash flow predictions, that kind of thing, to the market. Yeah,
that's in phase 5 of this bid round process. You get what you negotiate, not what you deserve.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Okay, so that's on phase 5, and at the minute you're on phase 3, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Super. Okay. Good. Okay, Pam, did you have any other things to pick up on with David, or I mean, we've covered a lot there.
I think we've really delved into the world of lithium and a great understanding of what's happening out there in Bolivia. It's fascinating to hear you talk about how you're producing a more green source, and of course, because I would just have thought electric cars, it's a good thing in terms of clean energy, but to hear the background story in terms of how hard rock, lithium that comes from hard rock, and the way it's having to be then burned at such a high temperature, it's not the greenest way. But of course, what you're doing out there in Bolivia with the salt lakes, it is. So that's fascinating, David. Thanks for sharing all that information with us.
Thank you.
Yeah,